very good morning and a very warm welcome to day 6 of the winter school titled EU-Asia Relations in a Multipolar World. Today here we are at the final session, or the concluding session of the entire winter school. It's great that despite it being a Saturday and a holiday for most of us, our participants have made it to the session. And with this, let me welcome each one of you, especially our guests, both Professor Nalapat and Dr. Himani. This panel discussion titled Strengthening EU-Asia Cooperation, where we discuss how do we move forward. Yesterday in the concluding session of the day, we discussed the challenges that we can and will encounter in EU-Asia relations. Today, we will discuss how do we go about tackling these challenges. That's something that we are going to discuss today. And I hand over the floor to Professor Neeta, who will moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Professor Neeta.
Thank you, Priya. And good morning once again, Professor Nalapat and Dr. Himani, who are the speakers for today, and all the participants who have been so very regular, attending almost all sessions. Until yesterday evening, I could see almost 37, 38 participants continuously listening and not missing even a single session. So it's been a very, very impressive participation by all the participants, and I really thank them for their active involvement in the program. And to take forward today's discussion is something very significant for us because Professor Nalapat has joined in. He has been a mentor to Manipal Center for European Studies and to me, and to many of us here in Manipal. Many faculty members in Manipal look up to him for his advice and guidance. So what we did in last 5 days, today being the 6th day, 5 days of rigorous discussions and deliberations on EU-Asia relations, and particularly in the multipolar world. Of course, there are quite a few discussions on the idea of multipolarity itself, and then looking at the geopolitical construct of Indo-Pacific and EU activeness in South Asia, EU strategic and commercial pursuits in Indo-Pacific, on connectivity and global gateway. And we also had discussion on EU-Asia relations, international politics of climate change, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. So many topics covered in the last 5 days deliberations on EU-Asia relations. And just as we ventured into these discussions, there were also challenges that came out that exist for EU-Asia relations. Of course, some of them strategic to trade related and people to people as well. So we have had discussions, but before we go ahead, trying to look at all the challenges and then look for a possible way out and the future for EU-Asia relations, I take a minute or two to introduce our guests. Of course, we know Professor Nalapat very well, but for the benefit of our participants who are not from Manipal, I wish to introduce Professor M.T. Nalapat. He's India's first Professor of Geopolitics and the UNESCO Peace Chair at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And he's also the Vice Chair of Manipal Advanced Research Group, and also the founding director of our own Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Somebody who has been a journalist for life and a former editor of Times of India and Mathrubhumi. He's currently the editorial director of ITV Network and the Sunday Guardian India. Since 2020, he is a member of the Executive Committee of the Editors Guild of India. Professor Nalapat writes extensively on security, policy, and international affairs, and has published several books. And I'm very proud one of them is published by Manipal Universal Press, MUP, here in Manipal. And we are also presently working on another book to be published that's written by him, and we're very happy and proud to be working with him on this. So a very special welcome to you, Nalapat sir, and thanks for being our mentor throughout in this journey of last 12 years. The way Manipal Center for European Studies has taken its journey, you have been there throughout. Thank you very much for joining me. Dr. Himani Pant is a research fellow at Indian Council of World Affairs, She has done her PhD from the Center for European Studies, School of International Relations at JNU. Prior to working with ICWA, she has worked for ORF, Observer Research Foundation, and Vivekananda International Foundation. She was also a visiting research scholar at KU Leuven, Belgium in 2018. So very warm welcome, Himani, to this discussion. And unfortunately, Professor Yol Liwe, who was also to join this particular discussion, is not able to join us due to some family emergency. But nevertheless, we go ahead with our discussion. So to begin with, in the last 5 days, as we discussed various aspects of Asia-EU relations, we came across quite a few challenges. Of course, there was one particular session yesterday evening, mainly to discuss the challenges. But it was visible through all sessions that there were some of these conflicting interests and contradicting worldviews that EU-Asia relations is riddled with. And there are some of the things that we could bring out. One was the one major challenge that came across in the discussions was EU's normativity, EU's normative concern or its normative agenda that drives its external relations. So that as coming across as a problem and a challenge in EU-Asia relations. Most of these challenges were kind of interconnected. Another challenge that came across was EU's focus on institutionalizing inter-regional cooperation. So whether this kind of an institutionalizing of inter-regional dialogue, can it really work in case of Asia? The way it is able to work with ASEAN, EU is able to work with ASEAN, why is it not able to work with others? Is it because of its focus on institutionalizing inter-regional dialogue? So that what came across as another challenge. Then EU and Asia's divergent attitudes towards the idea of sovereignty itself. And that's where EU's insistence on institutionalizing this inter-regional dialogue. Yesterday, I think Professor Liwe also brought in the idea of multipolarity within the regional order, particularly in Asia, as a major challenge in its the EU-Asia relations. Of course, then quite a few things, including the problems of perception as to how EU looks at Asia, generally through the Oriental lens, and how the Asia looks at Europe through the colonial lens, why they are not able to come out of these perceptional challenges. Then also a little discussion on political polarization and the rise of populism, right-wing populism in particular on both sides as a challenge to EU-Asia relations was also discussed briefly in some of the sessions. Then of course, a lot of internal problems of EU like its own technocracy, its bureaucratization, and kind of disagreements that exist amongst EU member states. So these are some of the challenges that were discussed during these 5 days. But despite all these challenges, is there a way forward? And that's the discussion for today. And I request Professor Nalapat to try and address as many of them as possible. I'm sure he will have answers or a lot more questions and very interesting insights on these aspects. So if you could take 10 to 15 minutes time and put across your ideas for us to take it forward.
Thank you very much, Neeta, for your very generous introduction. I would only like to say that for quite some time, I mean, given my age, several decades, I have actually looked at the Eurasian continent as a single entity. I have not separated Europe from Asia. And why? Because I do believe that although you have different ethnicities, you have different weather patterns, you have different historical patterns, the reality is that this huge continent is, in a sense, linked together, one to the other. And I think it's very important for us to accept this reality and not see Europe and Asia as two, if I may say so, I mean, not just hostile entities, which is absolutely not true, but also entities that are, in a sense, very divergent from each other. In the sense there are divergences, but I would say that the very strong commonalities that bind these two parts of the Eurasian continent are very, very important. And it is these commonalities that we need to focus on. That is a first if I may say so, postulate of what I would, of what limited views I'm going to express today. The second is, of course, the miraculous EU construct. And I'm not entirely sure that different countries in the EU have really basically realized the full potential of this miraculous construct, in which political boundaries and political barriers that have for so long created wars, conflicts, and so much of tension between different people, between different countries, that they have been, in a sense, eliminated almost by the EU construct. For example, if let us say a country is separated into 2 or 3 parts, and each of those parts is a full member of the EU, given that the EU construct will continue, and I hope it does, the reality is that it will have very little change on the ground. The fact is that people from any part, of what was once maybe a united country can live and work in the other parts, and vice versa. So the EU construct, in a sense, is designed, in a sense, to remove the tensions that have been created as a result of this legacy of political boundaries, political barriers, very often created not just by, frankly, if you look, in detail, and I've discussed this with specialists, ethnocentric claims are sometimes not really valid in science, because so many so-called different ethnicities are actually fundamentally the same. But different ideologies, different ways of behavior, different diets. But in a world in which, frankly, there's a huge amount of fusion of diets, of, if I may say so, coming together of ideologies. And in that kind of a world, I think the EU construct is an example to us in the Asian part of the Eurasian continent. And I do hope that in Asia, at least some of the countries will come forward and take forward an EU kind of construct, so that we avoid a lot of the tensions that have been there in this part of the world. South Asia, for example, you have a lot of tensions, and in my view, without changing any of the political maps, I think it would be very interesting to check whether, at least in a limited way, with a limited number of countries, you can have an EU kind of construct in South Asia. And I think that would be a very good start. India and Nepal, you have got a good start on that, in the sense that we can freely travel into each other's countries. Our currencies are the Indian currency is used in Nepal. In the same way, possibly, even one day, and I'm hoping about this, even one day Pakistan may, in a sense, come within that kind of construct. And remember, the EU countries have had massive battles with each other. They have fought world wars with each other. And today you would not know it. So I think the India-Pakistan conflict is nowhere near the kind of conflicts that have been there in the EU. So I would like to say it's an extremely important example for us in Asia to follow, and in fact for the world to follow. And I do hope the EU continues on that path, and we don't once again have a revival of political divisions, efforts at political domination, supremacy, etc., that so bedeviled Europe in the previous 2 or 3 centuries. These are the two, postulates on which I'd like to say. The first point is, and I think, the first point is very simple. When you're talking about democratic countries, and in Asia today, a large number of countries have become democracies. Now you can have a definition of democracy, whether some countries are fully democratic or not. But I think if you avoid this concept that the path that you have is best, and any deviation from that path is actually a deviation away from the ideal that you're talking about. We talked about racial supremacy. After a lot of effort, racial supremacy has been, in a sense, tamed across the world. It's not absent. It keeps coming up here and there, but it's been tamed. You have, for example, religious supremacy, the belief that the faith that you follow is superior to other faiths are inferior, and then it comes to very, very quickly to come into the view that those following the other faiths are somehow doing something wrong, and they need to adopt to, the faith that you follow. Now that, whether it's racial supremacy, religious supremacy, any kind of feeling of domination of human being over human being, I think it is not at all a healthy thing for society. And I have said this many, many times, I can say it again. I believe in a horizontal society, a society in which everybody is equal but different, rather than a vertical society in which you have high, middle, low, etc., and a clear gradations in terms of status. I think as human beings, our status is the same. Now, and for that reason, I'd like to say, look at the India-US template. Long back, more than 3 decades ago, I decided to focus on 2 countries, United States and China, for my education, for my research, for my traveling. And I'm delighted I did that, because now they've come as, in a sense, 2 different superpowers, the 2 different superpowers of today. Now, the India-US relationship, if you look at only the government-to-government relationship, it's been a very tormented relationship in very many ways since the 1950s. There have been a lot of disputes, problems. There a lot that India has done, the United States does not like as a government. What United States has done, India as a government and as a people as well would not like very much. But if you look at the people-to-people relationship, and I think our university, Manipal, is an example of this. As I recall, I think Manipal was one of the only universities in India where if you studied and you're an American citizen, you could get, the kind of benefits that you got for studying in an American university. So from the beginning, there's been a close connect between Manipal and the United States. And that connect, I'm very happy to say, endures. The point I'm trying to make is the India-US relationship was not a top-down relationship. Like, for example, the China-US relationship, in which, Deng Xiaoping and Richard Nixon decided that enough is enough. We are going to start working with each other, especially against the Soviet Union. And from the top, that kind of consanguinity started percolating down. The India-US relationship is a relationship that came from the people, from the bottom up, so to speak. And finally, it reached governments. When you had an individual like Bill Clinton, who tried very hard to, in a sense, constrain India during his tenure as president. In the final few months of his tenure, he came to India as a recognition of the fact that the India-US relationship, thanks to tens of millions of Indians and Americans across the world, including, if I may say so, that magnificent community of Americans of Indian origin. Thanks to that, this relationship had reached a takeoff point. So I want to say very clearly, the India-EU relationship, like I said that the EU can be a template for many other regions, the US-India relationship could be a template for Asia-EU relationships. And why is that so? Because the India-US relationship, it had NGO working with NGO. It had companies working with companies. It had universities working with universities. It had people working with people. You have people going there, people then coming back, going back. That kind of a broad template in which all of society is involved, not just the civil service, but civil society, has been an extremely important strengthening factor in the India-US relationship. And I do believe where Asia and the EU are concerned, that kind of a template is extremely important. In this connection, I'd like to say that if you look in terms of the policy of sanctions, for example, policy of not having any contact with the country, you've got that now with Myanmar, and I think the EU. The question is, even assuming that the ideals that you follow are the best for people. And certainly many of the ideals, for example, the national anthem of France, whenever I feel the need for inspiration, one of the things I listen to is the national anthem of France, because it is such a call to liberty and equality. So from that point of view, I'd only like to say that it's very, very important for us to have a total societal relationship, and to develop that relationship, and not to allow differences between governments to result in a cutoff of relationships with entire societies. By abandoning Myanmar, so to speak, to the junta is being strengthened, and the people of Myanmar are being weakened. This has been my position all along. I saw, for example, at first hand what happened in Iraq. I saw the human devastation. I saw the children. I saw the terrible situation that came. And of course, you would also have access. I mean, being an Indian, India is considered to be very friendly with the regime that was in power in Iraq, that led by Saddam Hussein. So you had access to them as well. And you found the huge difference in lifestyle. So the sanctions were affecting the people. They were not affecting the rulers. They're supposed to affect the rulers, but they affect the people. And the same thing is happening in Myanmar and places like that. So I would say that Asia, in a sense, has a lesson for Europe. And that is, for heaven's sake, please understand that don't punish an entire people for the crimes, real or otherwise, of a system, of a government. Please allow a contact between your people and their people. May not be governments, but your people and their people. And believe me, I can tell you, that will definitely further our common humanity and the goals that we share. Now, I would only like to say, Neeta, I'm not going to cross my limit, and I think 15 minutes is quite enough, frankly, for capsuling of what needs to be done. I mean, these are a very broad brush kind of situations. But if you look at the broad brush, if you go into the details, once you have the broad brush characterization, then it's much more easy to go into the details. Whereas if you don't have the broad construct, then you get lost in some irrelevant detail, in insignificant detail, and you don't focus on the important details. So that is the importance of broad brush characterizations. One thing I want to say, in my concluding thing is, for heaven's sake, we have all seen these sayings. You think too much about the past, you lose your future. It's, frankly, Neeta, I must confess, I never learned to drive a car in my life. Me and my other brother, second brother, we never learned to drive cars in our life, because at the time when we were born, it was assumed that that kind of a situation was looked after by other people. And by the grace of God, so far it has been. But my youngest brother, who was born 16 years after me, he can drive a car. He can do laundry. He can cook his own food properly. And that's been a very, very important point. So the point is very simple. It's an established practice in jurisprudence. You don't blame the parent for the children for the fault of the parents. And you certainly don't blame the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. So let's approach EU-Asia relationships on both sides without the hangover of the past, affecting our vision of the present and our ideas about what the future will be. We have had some unpleasant episodes. The Europeans also have had some unpleasant episodes. You had, for example, the Mongol invasion and the Mongol conquest. That was possibly not the most pleasant of experiences. We have had some very unpleasant episodes. But the reality is, it's 2021. It's the 21st century. And please, the past is gone. And please don't look in the rearview mirror, because if you do, you're likely to crash in front of you. So I'd only like to say, let's forget the hangover. Today's Europe is not yesterday's Europe. You go to Japan, you go to Germany, you go to Britain, you go to France, you go to any of these countries, and it's been my good fortune to go to these countries. I mean, what you read about the Japan and the Germany and Britain and France of 1930s or 1940s, or even much of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. It's no longer that same country. It's an entirely different country. For one thing, if you go to Britain, as in America, I found out when I went there, many decades ago, there are places where you can, you need not meet anyone who's not of Indian ethnicity. Whether it's the food, whether it's the music, whether it's the people, I mean, they're all of Indian ethnicity. So that's happening all over Europe. It's happening in Germany. Angela Merkel went ahead with a very bold decision of admitting some desperate refugees in large number into Germany. I think her party paid a heavy price for that. But overall, that is the right attitude. That is the right attitude for human beings. So I'd only like to end by saying India and, Asia and Europe are part of a common destiny, a common Eurasian continent. And I think let's focus on the future, not even the present, definitely not the past, except insofar as it helps us to design a better future. Our task, Neeta, is to ensure that the young people of this planet, have a much better future than, for example, my generation has had and your generation has had. And I think in that task, we need to work together, and Asia and Europe need to work together. God bless you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, sir, for this, bringing out all the commonalities despite all divergences, and also looking at something, even thinking of a possibility of an EU kind of construct in South Asia. It's a beautiful idea to begin with, and something very positive, because last few days we have been discussing about all distractions in bringing together, and of course some of these documents also, like the Global Gateway, that speaks about connecting people, and even that is seen as, rather than seeing it as something that is aligned with the SDGs, that is how it is designed, but also seen as something that is basically to challenge the BRI, and quite a few discussions around it we have had. And I'm sure that there are going to be quite a few questions coming once we also hear from Dr. Himani. Dr. Himani, would you like to start and take around 10 to 15 minutes to make the first argument, and then we take question answers?
Thank you, Professor Neeta. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm thankful to the Manipal Center for European Studies, Dr. Yatharth and Dr. Priya for inviting me. So to begin with, Professor Nalapat has already laid out the broad framework of how we can envision EU-Asia relations. I would delve into a few specifics of what I see are the challenges and the way forward. As the concept paper of this winter school also says, there has been a shift towards a more global strategy since 2016, when you came up with the European Union Global Strategy, which was, a substitution for the European Security Strategy of the 2003. Now, this particular 2016 strategy highlighted the importance of strategic autonomy for the EU, which is an important point for my discussion here. And, it also stressed the need for enhancing the credibility of EU as a global player. So it was basically in terms of the changing geopolitical environment that the EU sought this need to have a more global presence. Now, because I know a lot of discussion has already taken place, I would not go into the specifics, but in terms of EU-Asia and how EU envisages its role as a global player and relations with Asia, I'm sure it has come up in earlier discussions, but there is, this aspect of political will and consensus among member states that has emerged as a major challenges for how EU takes its decisions. So in this context, Indo-Pacific, as much as it provides an opportunity for EU-India, EU-Asia, it is also a major challenge, because if you look at the EU's strategy, which came out after France, Germany, the Netherlands had come up with their own individual strategies. So how are these major states, and then when you compare it with Central and Eastern European countries, which are also a part of China's Belt and Road. I'll come to the China factor shortly afterwards. So how to build a consensus in terms of EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is a major challenge. In this particular challenge, this sorry, I forgot to mention that there's also differences in terms of how Germany has Germany, Netherlands, and the Netherlands have envisaged their particular strategies. One has to understand that the German and the Dutch approach are more business oriented, whereas France has an added strategic dimension because of its obvious security presence in the region. So how EU has tried to come up with its own policy, which is over and above all these individual countries' policies, how EU then proceeds forward, because it is, as you said in the beginning, it's looking for a rules-based order. It has a normative approach. How then it goes ahead with the security dimension, which then also brings into question individual interest of member countries. So that is a major challenge. Coming to the China factor. So if EU has this Indo-Pacific strategy, how does it engage with China, which does not regard this region as Indo-Pacific? I mean, the Chinese and Russian discourse would look at this region as Asia-Pacific. So how, and when you look at EU-China relations, there was a lot of talk, last year and the year before in terms of increasing divergences between EU and China, but they went ahead with the investment deal. So there's a lot of, dichotomy, and that dichotomy is only natural because EU's interest in Indo-Pacific or EU's interest with China, it's all economic essentially. It is just that it is trying to become more it is inevitably becoming a more geopolitical player in terms of the global developments that have emerged. But how it balances its relations, bilateral relations with China, relations with Russia also become important in this context. And coming to the main point in terms of EU-Russia, and that would also be the way forward, if I say so, it really has to look for more cohesion in terms of what it really wants in the Indo-Pacific. To me, it is clear it is an economic player. But then, you cannot just have, you are inevitably also acting in a very geopolitical manner, but then how you balance your relations with Russia, especially when you are talking about, because you cannot have a Indo-Pacific strategy without Russia. Russia is an important player. So how I think it has to be more clear in terms of what it wants, because it is looking for more strategic autonomy. At the same time, it is looking towards the Indo-Pacific in a very through an economic lens, and it has its very own, differences within the European Union member states. So how to basically go ahead? So I think it's good that there is a dialogue going on with Russia. I'm not sure where that will lead, but increased dialogue with Russia would be important in terms of, charting out its Indo-Pacific strategy in the future, because as it goes ahead, it is, there is this transatlantic equation. There, EU is looking for strategic autonomy. So if you see US, Russia, and US China relations become important in terms of how EU, positions itself in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asian region. So in terms of what it means for India also, this inclusivity of China in the EU's paradigm is important, because then how will it, if it is looking at China as an inclusive partner in the Indo-Pacific region, then how does it engage with India? I mean, yes, India also looks for inclusivity, but there are some things that are not said. It's very clear that, how India is going ahead in this direction. So India-China relations also become important, because this entire winter school is in a EU-Asia and not EU-India. I would not really go into the Indian factor and the Chinese equation per se, but there are a lot of differences within Asian countries. There are a lot of differences between member countries. So there is a need for more dialogue there are some steps that are being taking place, but there are a lot of regional and global developments which are going to affect. And if it is only looking at economic lens, it is really going to be very difficult. I think clarity on the part of EU, more consensus, an image of consensus among member states would portray a better image. I think French presidency of the Council of the European Union is important. The next 6 months would be important in terms of how you would be, charting its domestic as well as foreign policy. So that is there. Then the other thing is in terms of EU's relations with Asia, while it balances its relations and interests with China, countries like India, Japan, South Korea are important. I think they need to be given as much importance. EU-India FTA resumption of negotiations is a positive step in this regard. But really, in terms of, once you go into the specifics of all these negotiations, there are a lot of differences. It's not going to be an easy way forward. Just that there is a resumption, especially within the context of India, which is going to be important partner in Asia is important. But when you look at what EU's, when you look at the normative structure, what EU really expects, it's high standards in terms of, when you look at trade related measures or anything, India would have to live up to them. For that matter, other countries in Asia, they're looking for, it's just not that we can expect everything from the EU. We have to really raise our standards to meet that level of this thing. But the EU also has to be very, very accommodating in terms of what it gets out of its Asian partners. In terms of way forward, I think, people to people and cultural or citizen diplomacy is important to enhance cooperation. Role of civil society and think tanks and universities is a crucial element of this awareness. I think regular track 2 and 1.5 dialogues does become relevant. I think it is very important to highlight and credit the EU-India think tanks initiative, which is doing some great work in terms of bringing, in terms of bringing great minds from both EU and India together. And it is fostering interactions between leading Indian and European think tanks through a series of joint projects involving research, publications, and events. So events such as these aim to, bring communities together. So that is a good example of citizen and cultural people-to-people diplomacy. A winter school like this one is also important in raising awareness about the European efforts in India, which is lacking. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Just that we need more cooperation between EU and Asian countries. This winter school is important because it includes a lot of partners in Asia. So yes, more of these interactions in more universities, taking it down to more, colloquial discourse, where it is not really confined to academic discussions as such, but also, the public in large would be important. To extend this argument a bit, I would say that Twin Sisters initiative between countries and states among partner countries could give a further boost. By definition, as you all know, but I'll just say that Twin Sister agreements are seen as an efficient tool to bolster culture and diplomatic ties, as well as trade and investment relations. For India, India has such several agreements with Germany, in Europe, as well as other countries throughout the world. So an EU level agreement, with countries in Asia could give a further, dynamism in taking these relationships forward. So yeah, I'll just end at that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Himani. And so I see quite some alignment in what Professor Nalapat said and what you said. Professor Nalapat, of course, as he himself called it, like a broad brush, which is very, very important. Basically setting kind of a vision for the entire gamut of things that would go into it. And also, though you went into the nitty-gritties, you also said it's a peoples-to-people contact. It's kind of track 2, which both of you emphasized on as to something that the way forward has to focus on. So thank you very much for that. And so just for further discussion, Professor Nalapat, what about this multipolarity within the region? Would that come in as a challenge in this way forward that you're thinking in terms of even people-to-people connect? I understand, of course, academics are probably are not very into these kind of geopolitical conflicts that exist, and they would actually look for opportunities wherever they are available and do engage with each other. But is it anyway? We also see that finally even the track 2 is generally needs facilitation by the state, and that's where the problem comes in. And this is our experience as we work with universities and different research organizations across the world. We do see quite a few challenges of that kind. So, however, the emphasis on track 2 isn't the state facilitation not very important, and are they ready for it in this multipolar regional order?
Thank you for the question. I would only like to say that if you, for example, you have a medical problem, a second opinion may be helpful. Now, track 2 can be helpful if it's a genuine second opinion. If it is only, in a sense, the first opinion, reinforcing the first opinion because of the reality of funding or other reasons, in which other options are not really worked out, including unorthodox options, well, then that track 2 really loses much of its value. The importance of track 2 is as a second opinion. And that basically means as possibly an alternative to what has been talked about in the official structure. So this is the problem that we are facing in many track 2 dialogues across the world. I mean, you go, let's say you visit a large country, let's say the United States, you go to Washington, and you go and visit the people in the government, different wings of the government. And then you visit some of the think tanks affiliated with those particular departments. It's unfortunate, but it's almost like going to the same place. They have almost the same views, the same reactions as each other. So what's the point of having a think tank when all your thinking can be done by one or the other section? So that is the importance, frankly, that if you have think tanks, they have to be independent. And one problem we're facing in India is that you have a large number of Indians who are high net worth, but somehow there's not much prestige in giving, in donating to an Indian think tank. The prestige is in donating to some well-established university that has already got billions of dollars in its capital base. So you become the 10,000 and 15th million dollar donor to that particular university. Whereas if you're the first $1 million donor to several good Indian universities and think tanks, and for example in small towns, then you'd be doing a lot better in the sense of promoting that kind of a culture. So I think it is important to understand that we should not be swayed by the, what do I say, by the conventional wisdom on what should be done. And the conventional wisdom says you give money to a foreign university which is extremely well known. Well, that's what you're doing something great, rather than giving to some possibly unknown university. But that unknown university may become another Manipal in 20, 30 years. I mean, we were an unknown university for quite some time, and then we became known by effort and by so much of work. That trigger can be this kind of thing. So I'd only like to say that point. So far as multipolarity is concerned, I certainly would strongly favor a multipolar world. We had a brief unipolar moment when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had the chaos of the Yeltsin period. And that was a very brief unipolar moment. I don't think that many of the decisions taken during that unipolar moment were good for the rest of the world. And in very many ways, many of the problems we are seeing now are as a consequence of that unipolarity. Now, it's fine to have partnerships It's fine to have cooperation, but there has to be a broad framework within which that cooperation and partnership takes place. If you have a partnership that degrades that broad framework, that seeks in a sense to destroy, then you have a problem. Take, for example, in Afghanistan. Say you have a group in Afghanistan that wants to enter government and basically hollow out the government and take over the government. And then, do exactly what it wants to do. Well, that is not cooperation. I've seen in Afghanistan, and I followed this, Neeta, from the 1990s, what is happening in Afghanistan. And, especially when the situation on the India, where it became of great importance to India because of what is happening in some parts of India. The reality of the situation is that there's been so much of talk about conciliation, about bringing people together. Say you bring people together and one person determined to finish you off, and he's armed and ready with a knife, and you lock the two of us together in a room and ask us to resolve through dialogue. Well, that knife is likely to come out, and it's not going to be a very win-win situation. So I'd only like to say that we have to be very careful that when we deal with countries, we have to deal with countries that basically are congruent with the idea of genuine multipolarity. That they don't want to replace one unipolarity, one dominant country with another unipolarity and another dominant country, because if you do that, you're basically incentivizing them and you're going to create more problems for yourself. I mean, you don't have to teach the Europeans that. Of course, the reality is mistakes keep getting made. In the 1930s, for example, there was an effort at bringing together some very contradictory elements. So the point is, as for example, some food is contradictory to the human body. Some other issues are contradictory to human welfare. Sometimes geopolitical relationships can also be contradictory to broad goals. So my point is, Neeta, cooperation is fine, conciliation is fine, excellent, but please make sure that the other country respects your framework, respects you remaining in that framework, and does not look on this discussion as a means of hollowing you out, as, for example, regrettably seems to happen in Afghanistan.
Thank you. So before, maybe I'll ask Himani. Himani, what would be your response to the earlier question? And then another question to Professor Nalapat is, how do you see India's role in this EU kind of construct in South Asia that you spoke about? But before that, maybe Himani, if you would like to respond to the earlier question.
Well, I echo Professor Nalapat's sentiments. He is quite, on spot when he says that, multipolarity is important. I mean, it is the way forward. It is how the world is turning out to be. But I particularly, agree that, as I said during my opening remarks, also one has to go beyond the usual academia remarks. There has to be more, this has to really reach the masses. There has to be more awareness, and I think the way forward for it would be to, take the focus to small cities and towns. Bigger cities like Delhi, Bangalore, etc. Yes, they are, but they have come to this position of, after a certain amount of time. So if we, on an individual scale, also make more efforts to bring more students and faculty from smaller cities, I think that would be the way forward. So yes, these dialogues are important, but require more diversity. So that is one aspect that I agree on. Diversity more, and then in terms of gender participation also, yes. So there has to be more inclusive, gender participation. There has to be more participation from smaller cities, and for that, I mean, if I just keep the context of India, Indian universities and the funding sort of thing would have to come from within and then also from outside. So how we go ahead with this is important in terms of giving, making the best use of track to diplomacy. Yes, I think German, for that matter, these language centers are very, active in the bigger cities. So that can be taken forward, and the centers that are active in bigger cities, be it French centers, German centers, or for that matter, other cultural and language centers, they can really be more inclusive in terms of, getting more students and faculty, and in terms of, giving those trainings also to smaller cities. So I think a university like JNU, Manipal, can also play a role in terms of, doing more orientation programs for, and we can, partner with more, universities in India in terms of getting that awareness. So yes, that is there. And on a larger scale, as I said, uh, multipolarity is important. There are many poles to this word. It's just that, every country in Asia has its own internal problem as well as EU. So there is nothing, very unusual about it. It is just that we have to learn to have more dialogue and, criticize and or, agree. That is a part and parcel of it. It is better than having a unipolar, moment where one country decides. So yeah, we are moving in the right direction, but we need more consultations within the Asian countries as well in terms of how we have more. We just cannot talk about lack of agreements within the EU when we have so many disagreements within Asia. It is just that we have to learn to exist with these differences and move in a more constructive way forward. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But this kind of a public sphere which comes into question, I mean, especially when it comes to Himani put at this point that, kind of people-to-people connectivity within Asia also something that is very significant and can change a lot for the region within the region. So if we look at that, Professor Nalapat, the kind of the sentiments that exist in the public sphere, particularly about China or about Pakistan. So this kind of a polarized ideas, is that something that's going to affect our relations with our Asian neighbors and something that come in the way of your vision, kind of a vision that you have, like a EU, like the institution coming up here within the region?
Yeah, actually, Neeta, my point is very, for example, Pakistan. We keep using the phrase Pakistan, Pakistan, when actually we are referring to the Pakistan military. And the Pakistan military, as I think almost everybody knows, is basically controlled by a single ethnic group in Pakistan, a single, if I may say so, language group in Pakistan, especially from a particular region, the Potewar region. So, when we talk about what happens is that the sins of that particular institution, with its very narrow societal base, is conflated onto the entire population. And then there is a belief the entire population is like this particular small segment. Now, I have, we have in every country, we have the fringes and we have the moderate middle. A healthy society is when the fringes become reduced and the moderate middle strengthens. A society that should be, we should look at carefully and try and correct is when the moderate middle shrinks and the fringes begin to grow. That's not very healthy for society. You understand? Now, so far as, for example, I would fully echo what Dr. Himani said regarding civil society. And the reality is that dissemination of information is important. I've been trained in journalism, and especially in the internet age, but even in those situations, in certain newspapers, we were very nervous about being factually wrong. So we had to check and recheck and recheck. And it has been a big problem in India to check and recheck, because there's so little information available to the public. If I want to know something happening in India, I have to turn to friends in other parts of the world who have the full information about what's happening in India, but information which is denied to the public of India. So I have to find out from different countries what's happening in my own country, because what is happening is that, as with the colonial period, it is not shared with the public. We have in India, for example, if we compare with the United States, the reality is too little information available in the domain of the state is shared with the public. So how do you have an alert public? How do you have a public which understands geopolitical realities, which is educated in what needs to be done by them, of them, unless they're given that kind of information? So this has been a real problem that we are facing in India. And unfortunately, that problem has become a little better. I mean, you have this, these acts, transparency acts. But then what happens? The minute you had these transparency boards, they were filled with individuals who spent their entire working lives keeping information from the public. So if I have, in a job where my job is to keep information from the public for about 38 years of my life, to believe that for the next 3 years, I'm going to suddenly change and share that information, it may be happening. There are many good people, who have worked hard at that. But I would have been much happier if you had civil society in charge of these civil organizations, rather than, again, a continuation of the colonial past in which, you have an all-powerful civil service determining what has to be done. So I think it's important that, the EU, the pandemic has been, frankly, a surreal experience. The pandemic has made bureaucracies very powerful. The pandemic has given them the power to do all kinds of things which affect our daily lives, our freedoms, and that is a different matter. Hopefully, it will not be there for too long. But in the EU, there has been, thanks to this the awakening of the public, much more, if I may say so, access to information, a much greater role in the framing of policy than is there in several Asian countries. And I think that is something in which Asia can learn from the EU, because essentially you have to have the public, because the public are probably, they're a good source to find out what they need. Now, again, I would echo what Dr. Himani said about silos. Now you have, for example, in India, in the sphere of, for example, defense purchases, you have a silo mentality. It's good for one particular service. But today I can tell you a modern war demands across the board. I'm not just talking of the armed forces. A certain country, in combination with some other countries, has been working in social media in India to incentivize and energize the fringe and basically shrink the middle. Cyber operations, for example, is a part of modern warfare. So in that situation, if you look at it only from your own silo, where the silo is a particular service or a particular department or a particular university or a department of a university, well, you're making a mistake. So I fully agree. There has to be a kind of a very clear contact and coordination, if I may say so, for dissemination of information and dissemination of best practices, so we can come up with the best possible solution.
Ma'am, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for that. And then just one last question about, as I asked earlier, what role do you envision for India, if at all, there's a kind of EU kind of construct for South Asia you spoke about earlier? What would be India's role in that?
I'd like to say, I'm sorry, if Dr. Himani can speak first, I'll speak after that. Dr. Himani, please.
Himani?
So basically, I understand you're asking for what role does EU and India, could you repeat that question, please?
Asked, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that question was particularly because Professor Nalapat spoke about EU kind of construct in South Asia. I asked him if it was, what was his, in his vision, the role of India in that. But earlier what I asked, okay, I think even I lost the question I asked earlier. But it was about civil society engagement as to whether, yeah, I don't know, what I asked Professor Nalapat earlier was whether even for track 2, the kind of support that is needed from state, is it coming or not coming? And is that a problem or a challenge to universities, research organizations as we have experienced? And whether it is possible that you spoke about connecting a university or connecting people within Asia. Is that going to happen in this kind of an environment? That will be it.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to know whether I should answer that question or this question first. Yeah, so in terms of civil society, I entirely echo what Professor Nalapat said. To add to what he said about the dissemination of information, I would not repeat what he said. Just adding to that, I think we as researchers also need to diversify our reading material, the sources that we are referring to. What happens is that you're referring to the usual newspapers, usual rhetoric. I'll give you one small example. These days, you can read all over the newspapers about, the NATO-Russia meeting. And the general sentiment is to read about it in the Western sources because that's the most accessible. It's all in English. So it's, accessibility is an point here in terms of, where we what we open. So we basically rely on that, but the fact is that we also have to look at the other side of the argument. We may agree with one set of arguments, that is all right. I mean, I'm not asking or saying that one should refer to just one source, because it should not refer to one source because that could be biased. All I'm saying is you may have your own opinion, but at least have a diverse reading of the sources. So taking that argument to a present context, when you're talking about Asia, and in terms of what terms like Pakistan, Afghanistan, whatever we are reading, just not rely on one set of sources. We have to see, and then use a better judgment in terms of what we think of it. But we really, really need to have a look at more. What are the Afghanistan people talking about it? If you're talking about Afghanistan, what are the Pakistani scholars writing about it? Also read about what the Western scholars, what the Indian scholars, and this diversity of sources in terms of research also, it's very important. In terms of fact checking also, it becomes important. So reading of sometimes we just tend to read a lot and you refer to a primary source, it does not exactly say that. It's blown out of proportion in the secondary material. So it's really important to look at primary sources, statements from each side first, and then also look at the secondary sources. I think that is that what I've learned over the years is, it's easy to disagree with the Western source, fine, but what have you read to disapprove or disagree with that source? So dissemination of information has various layers to it. First, you have that information percolated into all sectors. So yes, people like you and me and everyone of us, in terms of what we share with our family and friends, the informal communication also becomes very important. At times people don't know what think tanks do. That is also a reality. People don't know what is happening in Europe. People don't know what is happening in Russia. We just know the outer layers. We talk about what is not happening between India and China, but we would not talk about what is happening. So there is a lot that is happening despite the political differences, the so-called military dynamics. So there's a lot that goes on that is part of the diplomacy. So be it India's relations with Asia, EU's relationship with Asian countries, there is a need to diversify sources. There is a need for more formal and informal communication, and a need for this pooling of resources. So as I said, these sessions like this are important. We need to have these more, and also including more universities, and And informally too. I think informal communication in this aspect also is very important. But my main point and emphasis would remain that we really need to diversify our reading material in terms of what perception we build about any country or any region. That would be very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Himani. And yeah, of course, there is quite some asymmetry in terms of both the production as well as access of information. So that's again a kind of a larger thing that exists, and that's the reality. And but still within that, whatever diversity one can have access to, I think would give a new direction to information accumulation and also kind of a dissemination later of the same thing. So now, Professor Nalapat, about your vision for India's role in South Asia, and then we can open the floor for questions.
Yeah, I just add on to what Dr. Himani said. China, for example, it's basically run by the Communist Party of China, the leadership of the party, and people look at People's Daily. They look at the big newspapers of Shanghai or Guangzhou. They look at Global Times. And they say, well, this reflects the Chinese opinion. The fact is, it's a tiny provincial newspapers brought out by the provincial party committees that truly reflect the party's opinion to itself. It's not the opinion that they want others in the world to believe is their opinion. It's their actual opinion to themselves. So rather than looking at the big newspapers, if you look at these tiny little publications that nobody cares about, including outside the province or the town in which they are printed, well, that gives you a much better read into what the actual policy is. So I quite agree that sources are very, very important. And we need to understand what the primary sources are and what disinformation is. Because in today's age, I mean, more important than disseminating information, it's a tactic, it's a strategy to multiply the extent of disinformation. So far as I would like to echo what Dr. Himani said, that you really have to go and find out what is really relevant in these matters. It's not what is conventional regarded relevant. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of studies in the Western world. I remember, quite some time ago, when people used to talk about Wahhabism as a purest form of Islam, when some of us said not at all. This is a fanatic thing which has nothing to do with the overall, tone of a great religion. But the Western world, even today, you have people who say pure Islam is Wahhabism, and very frankly, that is not very helpful to the Muslim world, which is now trying very hard to modernize, and even in Saudi Arabia. So that's important. So far as South Asia is concerned, I'm optimistic, very frankly, about India and South Asia. And also in terms of, there are certain values in human rights that I think India should stand for. And these values in human rights, I think we should be quite clear about them. And they can be, if the government doesn't want to say it, well, you can have NGOs that are saying it. You can have think tanks that are saying it. And if they say it, there's no problem. Because the reality is, if you have a foundation of freedom of diet, dress, lifestyle, matters like that, that's a very strong foundation on which to build our common identity. And South Asia, we talked about a common humanity, which is true. But South Asia, very definitely, there is a common, humanity, a common identity. I just want to say Neeta, something which may look a little tangential. Look at Sanskrit. It's a beautiful language, one of the world's most beautiful languages. But the reality is, hardly anyone was taught Sanskrit for thousands of years. Hardly anyone in the population at that particular point in time was taught this beautiful language. And as a consequence, you're seeing where Sanskrit is, and you're seeing where English is, where almost everyone has been taught English in some form or the other. Fortunately, I can get by with my Hindi, although it's a strong Malayali accent. But the reality is, everywhere you go, in Bihar, in UP, in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, people want to speak English. And they speak English. And frankly, many of them speak very understandable English, even though their incomes are way below what is regarded as desirable to anybody. So I'd only like to say that, you know, knowledge of a language, knowledge of information, knowledge of a situation, if that is preserved and protected in a narrow band of people, as for example, you have a colonial kind of bureaucracy which says that, you know, we alone know how to deal with this information, others do not know. I mean, then that is actually a regressive and negative step in national and, you know, building and in fence building between the different countries of South Asia. I am very confident the different peoples of South Asia will want to come together and welcome the chance to come together. Even in Pakistan, if you take away the military component, the people want better relations with India. And that, I can tell you, can happen and will happen in the course of time. Hopefully circumstances will lead to that. In the case of Europe, this is something that Asia can teach Europe. Europe has had a migration policy which frankly doesn't make much sense. You know, I used to point out to my European friends when I used to go to Germany, when I used to go to France, you are welcoming people who will come and be a, you know, a problem on your public purse. People who are wonderful people, but you are stopping people from India, from Hyderabad, from Chennai. I didn't mention Trivandrum because then that will be a kind of a regional bias. But Chennai and Hyderabad, for example, Bangalore, who could come immediately, work, produce, and give taxation and benefit society. You're blocking these people. And does it make sense to have that kind of a migration policy? Even today, there's much that is wrong in the EU's migration policy. And I think that is one lesson that the EU can learn from the experience of Asia. I'm not talking about policies of Asia, because in Asia, sometimes policies and experience are not the same, but the experience of Asia would be a good lesson to many countries in Europe, because some of their migration policies do not make any sense, even from a very narrow point of view.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I think we'll open the floor for questions. I'm sure there'll be quite a few. Anybody who wants to go first? Questions? It's a Saturday afternoon. Okay, there, Priya.
Yeah, I would like to share that I agree with the opinion, and that's why I feel very appreciative to have opened the participation to me as a master's student in University Malaya. It has also allowed me to not only to listen to various perspectives of speakers from, you know, different countries, and also the interactive sessions also allowed me to have more closer interactions with other students. So I think that is also good, which is also to you know, to give opportunity for us to build rapport and also discussion towards the towards the understanding. Yeah, I agree. For example, yesterday in my master class, there was presentation of a group of 4 students. They present the ASEAN for only the prospect collaborate with that one country. And I say in the academic world, we should not collaborate. Why should ASEAN collaborate with this country only? Why not also with other countries? So with that, I would like to express my appreciation to has opened the winter school to me in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Yeah. You have been a wonderful participant, sharing your views.
Neeta, if I can make just one point. You know, Shravasti, where Lord Buddha spent so much of his time. Shravasti has been revived and brought to life. Do you know by whom? By a Malaysian citizen, a lady called Adeline Lim. And she has brought Shravasti to life. So, you know, this is the point. This is where international cooperation comes in. And I mean, I would like to thank Malaysia for what a Malaysian citizen has done to Shravasti. And of course, it's a wonderful country in other ways as well.
Oh, great. Abhishek, and Priya, do you mind if I take Abhishek's question first and then come to you?
Yes, ma'am, participants first and then we can.
Yeah. Abhishek.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Nalapat. My question is to you, actually. we keep hearing you in the News X and your enlightening talks and discussions on foreign policy and even otherwise also. Sir, my question is on, as you said, this EU construct, possibility of a EU-like construct in, let's say, South Asia. So with your huge experience and you have been writing and all, what could be the guiding principle? Like if we have to find out like one or two guiding principles. So if we look at EU, it was war-ridden at one point of time, and then Cold War happened and they were fighting. And then this became one of the factors. And then the other polarities emerging in the world force them to do something like this. So what could be these one or two guiding principles if we have to see one or two guiding principles for EU-like construct in South Asia, keeping in mind that there is a very big powers in India and all that. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
It's fine, because my question is almost connected to what Abhishek, so I'll just...
Yeah, please go ahead, Priya.
Yeah, so exactly, if you look at the EU integration, history of European integration, we know that it's basically the history of economic integration. And given the post-war condition actually fueled them to come together, and, economic was the basis with which, of course, the European integration story started off. When you speak about an EU construct or, having a similar regional integration model in South Asia, what do you envisage as the, let's say, underpinning principle? Is it economics here? Do we go political, or should we go beyond the realms of economics and politics and look at something else altogether, like the people-to-people connectivity that you spoke about? So I think I'll leave it at that.
I just want to say that if you go to San Jose or you go to any of these tech areas, you'll find that an atmosphere of freedom is very, very important in the promotion of knowledge. Very, very important. And that is where, for example, countries like India, United States, etc., they score. And where certain countries which have different systems, they can take tech from other countries, but they can't develop their own tech, because you need that atmosphere of freedom. You had that even in the Soviet Union. I remember, scientists who were working on important programs for weapons or space and atomic energy, they were living in communes of their own, where there was freedom of the speech. They could say what they liked about the Communist Party, and it was a very free atmosphere. That freedom is very important in the knowledge economy. I'd like to say that I think, I wouldn't use the one bear in the room that we have not talked about is Russia. Russia is a magnificent country. I mean, the way Russia, for example, ensured in the previous century, that in the first half of the previous century, that Europe was saved from a tyrannical dictatorship was so important. But somehow the EU countries just cannot come to an accommodation in a country as large as that. Now we have done that in India. Look at the Hindi-speaking people. In terms of size, in terms of population, they are what Russia is to Europe. And yet you have a Hindi-speaking Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, who said, yes, one state in the country opposed the abolition of English, Tamil Nadu. No other state, frankly, opposed it, except Tamil Nadu. And you had a Hindi-speaking Prime Minister, okay, we'll keep English. And that is, the fact of the matter is, whether I have traveled across the Hindi belt, I have not seen any kind of, this domination of numbers or whatever it is, which people are worried about will happen if the EU and Russia come close to each other. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Russian people are going to be like that at all. And therefore, I think the experience of India is important. I think when we are talking about Asia and Europe and EU, let's also talk about Russia and EU. And I think Asia and Russia are very closely linked to each other. Half of Asia is Russia. Half of Europe is Russia. I think we have come to terms with Russia as Asians far better than some countries in Europe. And practically every country in Europe, where the European Union is concerned, has. I think that could be an example. The reality is, it's not a question of numbers. It's a question of attitude. It's a question of, and that attitude, I can tell you, is not reliant on number. You may have people who are very tiny number and you yet have a very supremacist attitude. You may have people who are very large in number who have a perfectly easygoing attitude. And I do believe the EU is worried about the former, but actually should be looking at the opportunities offered by the by the latter, where Russia is concerned.
Okay, good. So Anirban, and then there's one question by Rishabh on the chat, which I'll take later. Anirban first, please. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for giving me the floor. So my this particular question of mine is actually directed to Professor Nalapat. So this particular question is aligned with the past few questions which has been asked, with the idea of South Asia, like Professor has just pointed out about how the South Asian countries can come together in a regional arrangement. So we can see some of the examples like SARC. But as one of the articles by Ashish Nandi, I remember right now that he has debated that idea of South Asia is a contested one. And it has been created in response to some other regional groupings in Southeast Asia as well as Europe as well. So do you think South Asia can come as a grouping, since despite its leaders whipping up nationalist frenzy in a situation where it is where the countries have some of the countries have bitterly fought with each other, and in some situations many of the South Asian countries doesn't look at each other eye to eye. So in that situation, can we particularly say that this particular idea is relevant enough for a divided South Asia?
Thank you. Sir, there is one more question, if I can read it out from the chat. This is from Rishabh Balakrishna. It aligns well, so I'll read of that and we can answer both of them together. So Rishabh says, this is even after EU successes in various other sectors, building up a common identity is having trouble being accepted. How will the push for a common identity in South Asia have a positive impact, seeing how contrasting the countries in South Asian territory are? Will it backfire? So I think if we can plug them in answer to that.
Look, my grounding and training has been in journalism, and that basically means experience. It means practical, direct field visits and field experience. I mean, in the United States, for example, in the UK as well, you have, if you take a taxi, you'll find, and I know this sounds a little unacademic, but I'd only like to say, I wish non-academics will be more academic and academics will be a little more non-academic. I found in many places, Pakistan taxi drivers, Pakistani origin taxi drivers would not take money from me. They said, nothing doing, we don't want to take money from you. And in fact, once or twice, there were some pretty long distance things in which the $60, $70, 15, 20 pounds, it is not a small amount of money, at least for us in India. They said, absolutely not. We love you guys. We love the Indian people. Now, the reality is, as I said, Pakistan is much more than the Potiyawar region and the uniform people of the Potiyawar region. It's Balochistan, it's Sindh, it's Pashtunistan. And the reality of the situation is that across South Asia, these kind of linkages are very strong. Look at Sri Lanka, for example. If you look at geopolitical terms, a lot of the literature says Sri Lanka and India are separated from each other. The ruling group in Sri Lanka is very pro-China. That ruling group in Sri Lanka visits 20 times more temples in a matter of 1 year than I have visited in my entire life. Of course, my wife Lakshmi makes up for me. She visits, and the average of both of us is pretty good. But what I want to say is that when Sri Lanka had a big problem, with the terror attack, the tourists that really saved the Sri Lankan tourism industry were from India. The other tourists kept away, Europeans kept away, Japanese and Chinese kept away, but Indians kept coming because for India, frankly, they shut this off and they kept the tourism industry going. So the fact of the matter, there is an organic link in South Asia. Remember, unlike the ASEAN countries, we were all part of one country at one point in time. And I'd just like to say, in a world where economics is important, one, that's why I say liberty and freedom of action and freedom of thought and freedom of lifestyle is important. And the second thing I'd like to say is that, you know, where we are concerned, we were at one stage, one country, and that is a historical experience that cannot be eliminated in a few decades. So I'd only like to say the ground is fertile, but you have to look at it in a different way. If we, for example, promote human rights in, let us say, in the western border, on the other borders, for example, in Myanmar, for example, in Pakistan, and we stand up for people who are looking for their human rights, and then I think it is a much stronger way to build a future, kind of construct. When I say EU construct, what I mean is the EU has worked a miracle in its part of the world. We can work a similar miracle in our part of the world. Having met South Asians across the board multiple times, I mean, right to the present day, I am very confident this is feasible.
Thank you very much. And there's one question to Dr. Himani. I think it is coming from one of our students, Aditya Chauhan. With France assuming the role of president of the Council of the EU and it being the resident power in Indo-Pacific, unlike other member states, can we expect a comparatively more assertive approach from the EU in the region, and in what ways?
Yes, I would say yes. But, you know, the period is too short to see magnificent, sort of a change, but it will be a priority for France. It has security interest. I mean, and that is, as you said, you know, it is the only resident power, and, you know, as I said earlier, also it is the only country there which has really put emphasis on the security dimension. So given its own interests, given its dealings with India, defense dealings within the bilateral framework as well as within this, it is definitely going to give a push to have a more assertive policy, if one were to say. However, given the rotating nature of the presidency, it will give a push, it will make a start, but then, as always, you know, for example, if you look at the Porto summit, it really was, in terms of India, EU, it played an important role in terms of resuming, a lot of things in terms of FTA and others, but then came Slovenia and now France. So yes, the time is limited, so one should not expect a lot. But yes, at least it will be instrumental in terms of giving a renewed push in giving it a more active nature. But then that will have to carry on as we have further presidencies. So in short, yes, and how it would do it. In what ways? Yes, of course, it is going to prioritize its own priorities, its interests. But at the same time, as you know, it has, for example, differences with Australia in terms of when, you know, this entire AUKUS came up. So it really has to also navigate its own differences, for example, with Australia. So how it balances its own in terms of economic priorities, because, you know, if it's dealing all these arrangements have an economic dimension, so it really would have to find a way in terms of its own bilateral interests and EU functions as a whole. So it can only give a little more assertion in terms of, giving it a more push in terms of, having, prioritizing its security interests, but it really would have to navigate its bilateral interests, economic interest while doing it. So in short, 6 months is too less to really have a very decisive change, but yes, it will give, you know, that boost. It will kickstart, as to say, for a more active policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the session, and I wish to thank. Okay, there's one last question. I think this is from Abhishek again. Mr. Nalapat, in total agreement, Pakistani and Bangladeshi do make parathas and even offer veg food for us Indians when they meet us in Europe. This is wonderful. I think we couldn't have imagined a better closure for this 6-day event. everybody being positive, hopeful, and everybody speaking in one voice about people-to-people connect. And if you see, that is also at the heart of Manipal Center for European Studies. Since its beginning, we have been multidisciplinary. We have always focused on multiple parts, though it's an area studies work that we do, but it is a lot to do with literature, history, society, intellectual history, culture, language, education policies, and a lot more. So it really feels very nice that we are concluding this entire 6-day event with this focus on people-to-people connect, on which we strongly believe. So thank you very much, Professor Nalapat, for being part of this. Your presence means a lot to us. And also thanks a lot, Himani, for coming in and sharing your views. So we have from young to senior scholars all coming together in discussion, and I'm sure participants have benefited by being here for the last 6 days. They have been wonderful as participants. Some of them have been very attentive, listening, asking questions. And thank you very much for being with us throughout in this period. Thank you once again, Professor Nalapat and Himani. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
Thank you.